The Cleveland torso murders is undoubtedly America's first true serial killer that set the papers ablaze. He killed without care, did not distinguish between gender or age, and this Butcher of Kingsbury Run never left a body intact. This is Evidence Obscured, the place where we don't sugarcoat the truth no matter how disturbing it gets. If that's the way you like your true crime, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. This is the case of the Cleveland torso murders, and in many ways, it's the case where America's fascination with true crime began. It all started on September the 5th, 1934, in Kingsbury Run, a neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio. Neighborhood is a strong word here. Most people referred to it as Hobo Jungle. Since the crude oil industry collapsed, the mass amount of immigrants that had come in from Europe to find work found themselves impoverished and desperate. Shanty towns like Kingsbury weren't rare, and most people lived in the kind of conditions that meant a sewage river probably ran past your home and cholera outbreaks were common. If the unemployed weren't in the bars, the gambling dens, or the brothels, then they were sleeping off last night's bender in their houses made of rotten pallets and whatever scrap they could find. The body of a woman, presumed to be in her mid-30s, washed up on the shores of Lake Erie. Well, some of her body. Her torso, thighs, one arm, and one hand was found on the beach. Fishermen also reported seeing a head and possibly legs and feet float by their vessels, but the fish got to those before police did. They called her the Lady of the Lake, and she stood out amongst the large number of murder victims that plagued these impoverished towns. For one, she'd been expertly dismembered. Her limbs were cut off cleanly at the joint and there were no hesitation marks. Secondly, her body had been treated with some kind of chemical, making the skin red and leathery. No one's ever been able to pinpoint exactly what chemicals were used on the victims, but that and the dismemberment became the killer's calling card. A year later, almost to the day, on September 23, 1935, another headless corpse turned up, this time at the end of Kingsbury Road, at a dead-end road called Jackass Hill. The head was found a few feet away, buried in a shallow grave. 29-year-old Edward Anthony Andrassy was a recently unemployed orderly at a mental institution. Besides the decapitation, he'd been surgically castrated. His body had also been completely drained of blood, and he had rope burns on his wrists and ankles and was only wearing socks. Edward died of hemorrhage and shock, meaning that he was probably alive when he'd been decapitated. Edward had only been dead for 2 to 3 days, and during the search of the area, they found another body. Just like Edward, he'd been expertly decapitated and emasculated. This victim also had the same strange chemical treatment, making the skin red and leathery. But he'd also been burned on top of everything else. The arson was apparently not an attempt to obscure evidence. Instead, just his hair had been singed off in what happened to be an act of desecration of the body. This victim was never identified. Police were starting to get worried, and the public were about to get alarmed with them, when 44-year-old Florence Genevieve Polillo's dismembered remains were discovered in January 1936. Florence was a sex worker, a barmaid, and a waitress in the Kingsbury area. But this scene wasn't like the rest. Florence's remains were carefully wrapped in paper and stuffed into bushel baskets. The baskets were then carefully placed in front of a mill, like some macabre sale from a butcher displayed for prospective buyers. Apparently, the killer was tired of going unnoticed. He wanted some appreciation for his work. Florence's remains were not treated with the same chemicals that the others were, and her head was never found. In June of that same year, a man's head was found wrapped in a pair of trousers, also on Kingsbury Run. The body that matched the head was found displayed right in front of the police station, but there was a little more to this body than the others. He had 6 tattoos, but even with those identifying markers, no one ever came forward to identify him. John Doe, who'd now become known as the Tattooed Man, was also drained of blood, but there were no pools around the head or body, making it clear that he'd been moved there after death. Mr. Tattoo had no identifiable drugs or alcohol in his system, yet the cuts on his neck indicated that he'd been alive when he was decapitated. He had no ligature marks on his wrists or ankles and had no defensive wounds at all, but he was castrated and decapitated like the rest. So apparently, the men were castrated and the women were bathed in some kind of chemical treatment. The killer wasn't picky about gender, but he did treat his victims differently based on whether they were men or women. By the time the sixth victim was found, a month later, the city and the papers were ablaze with what they called the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. He was found in the forest, situated right by a homeless camp. He was thought to be one of the vagrants that hopped the trains and that he'd been dead for approximately 2 months. This scene was again different than the others. He was definitely killed where they found him, so the butcher wasn't always as constrained as it seemed. And his head was found a few yards away from the body. Not only was he decapitated and castrated, his torso was cut in half just like the others. Detective Eliot Ness, who'd taken down Al Capone, was put on the case, and everyone breathed a little easier. No way was this guy going to get away with a rock star like Ness on the case, right? Well, they couldn't have been more wrong. The butcher was just getting started. In September, another suspected train hopper was found near the train tracks that neighbored Kingsbury Run. He's never been identified. His torso was cut in two, and near the body, they found a hat with blood on it and a blue workman's shirt that was wrapped in newspaper. Most likely both belonged to the victim. This time, the killer had removed the victim's kidneys, stomach, and genitals. These and the victim's head were never recovered. By now, police had interviewed more than 1,500 people, and the lead investigator had even gone undercover as a homeless man, hoping to catch a break, but they all came up with squat. In February of '37, a Jane Doe's chemically treated and dismembered remains were discovered on the shores of a lake 4 months later. Given the amount of water in her cavities, it's possible that she was drowned, but they only ever found her torso, so it's hard to say for sure. The ninth victim was found in June 1937 under Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. Though she'd been dead for nearly a year by the time she was discovered, she'd been placed inside a burlap sack after being dismembered, and inside the bag was a newspaper from a year prior, matching up with the coroner's estimated time of death. Only one woman could be found to possibly be this victim. 40-year-old Rose Wallace was reported missing around the same time the victim would have died. She was last seen at the same bar where Florence Polillo worked, and she matched the age of the remains. But that has not been confirmed, so officially, she's still a Jane Doe. The next month, victim number 10, another John Doe's torso and both his thighs were fished out of a river. They were placed in a sack. But there were some things missing, besides the rest of his limbs and head, All of his organs were removed from the torso. In early April, a woman's leg was located in the same river, and a month later another sack containing her hands, torso, feet, and thighs washed up. Of all the victims, she was the only one who had any substances in her system, specifically morphine. Whether she used it recreationally or if her murderer drugged her, it's hard to say. On August 16, 1938, the two final known victims were found, making them the 12th and 13th victims that we know of. First was a woman discovered in a scrapyard by men looking for scrap metal. Her body parts were wrapped in plastic, cardboard, and paper. Her hands and feet, which were also amputated, were with half of the torso, but the other half of the torso and her head were missing. Later that day, the separated body and head of John Doe was found in front of City Hall, placed in full view of Eliot Ness's office window. This guy had now chosen 2 locations to dump bodies in front of law enforcement offices, and he undoubtedly planned for his 13th victim to make the biggest impact. He wanted a reaction. Boy, did he get one. Detective Ness collected 35 other detectives and a few dozen volunteers, and they stormed into Kingsbury Run. They turned over shacks, raided bars, and arrested 63 men in the process. Ness ordered the whole of Hobo jungle to be burnt to the ground. Hundreds of people, now without a roof over their heads, were charged with being homeless. He got every man and woman's fingerprints, questioned every able-bodied man, and let them all loose with nowhere to go, no resources, and no possible way to rebuild on the ruined ashes that were left behind. Ness claimed that he wanted the killer's main hunting ground taken out of the equation, and that by burning it all down, he was actually saving lives. Yeah, nobody was falling for that either. Ness was just miffed that the killer had the stones to flaunt that last body in front of his office, and he decided to punish an entire community for it. His reputation never recovered. Even if he took out a big crime boss like Al Capone, the hundreds of people he made suffer with that stunt threw any previous good works he'd done into the fire along with their homes. And Ness ruined any chance of catching this guy. You guessed it. The Cleveland torso killer disappeared into the wind after that. When he went, or what he did after this barbaric debacle, is anyone's guess. But he definitely got away. Before Ness took over, police were convinced that the killer was a bricklayer by the name of Frank Dolezal. Dolezal was an ex-boyfriend of Florence, and he knew Rose Wallance and Edward Andrassy. Not that that means much. Everyone in that part of town had crossed paths with each other at one point or another. Dolezal signed a confession before being allowed to go to the hospital for the 6 broken ribs that he'd received during that interrogation. Sounds like a coerced confession to me. Hell, that actually sounds like straight-up torture. Dolezal was found dead in his cell a few months after his arrest, hanging from a hook that he'd hung himself from. Only the hook was an inch shorter than Dolezal was, so apparently he magically managed to hang himself from a height that he was taller than right before the case could go to trial, and several more people were being killed. Obviously, I'm not a fan of this suspect, and I think that the horrific injustice that Frank Dolezal suffered needs just as much justice as the 13 victims we're here to examine today. The only other viable suspect, Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, however, is a very interesting one. Unlike Frank Dolezal, he had a very long background in human anatomy. Every single one of the victims' heads were disarticulated at the level of the 3rd intervertebral disc. This very specific placement to decapitate someone is not a butcher's habit. It's extremely specific to medical students' training. So Sweeney had the skills, that much is certain. He also had the personal background. Sweeney was a violent alcoholic that abused his wife and sons. He drank his medical practice into the ground, and during Prohibition, he started frequenting shanty towns like Kingsbury Run to get his hands on some of that gut rot that ruled his life. A month before the last 2 murders, Sweeney checked himself into a mental institution where he was diagnosed as schizophrenic and an alcoholic. Ness did look into Sweeney. He even tracked him down at the asylum and gave him 2 lie detector tests, both of which he failed. Still, Ness let Sweeney go, probably because Sweeney was the cousin of a congressman at the time, and just 2 weeks later was when the final body was placed in full view of Ness's office window. Ness kept all of this secret. Sweeney being a suspect, his questioning and the polygraphs weren't even put in the police records that Ness handed in. So no one except the polygraph tech even knew that Sweeney was being looked into. A homeless man named Emil Fronek filed a report in 1939 that a doctor tried to drug him. Unfortunately, Fronek wasn't entirely coherent, probably suffering from an undiagnosed psychiatric illness, and he could only vaguely recall the general area where the doctor's offices were. Turns out, Sweeney had an office in that area, but at the time, police dismissed Fronek as unreliable, and they never followed up on the claim. To put the nail in the coffin, so to speak, Sweeney's office was connected to a funeral home, thus giving him access to the facilities needed to dismember bodies and dispose of the evidence in the building's drainage system. Not to mention the various embalming fluids that could have caused the chemical treatment on the women's bodies. This all came to light when Ness tried to take Sweeney to court for the murders a decade after the killings stopped. With no physical evidence to justify a trial, it got thrown out almost immediately, and Ness never even got a search warrant approved to search Sweeney's home and workplaces. Still, for years, Ness received postcards taunting him that he let the killers slip through his fingers. The cards were signed Sweeney, even though Sweeney denied ever sending them. So Sweeney sounds like the guy, right? Again, there's a hiccup with Sweeney. Many argue that he couldn't have used the medical facility in the morgue next door for that long, because there were so many employees that it's unlikely that he'd have been able to avoid suspicion. And then there's the fact that there were similar murders happening in Pennsylvania at the same time, between 1923 and 1949. 9 men were dismembered and dumped in the swamplands around New Castle. I disagree that the 2 cases are connected. Yes, the dismemberments were expertly done, and the victims were all headless, homeless, and unidentified. But there were only male victims. There were no signs of chemical treatment to their bodies, and no indication that the killer wanted to flaunt his skills. He went out of his way to hide their bodies in the swamps. Personally, I think that if Sweeney didn't have family in politics and a stunning amount of legal knowledge to keep police from ever officially charging him, he'd have been searched and investigated much more thoroughly. Ness liked him for the murders, that much is clear, but his hands were tied when it came to conducting searches. Funny how a guy who didn't give two tools about burning an entire community's homes to the ground was willing to follow the rule of law when it came to a monster who just happened to go to college and have a cousin in office. Here's what I think. Ness was a douche, but he was probably right about Sweeney. Hey, maybe it was someone else entirely. But what we can say for sure is that whoever did this was way too bloodthirsty to ever stop. Wherever this guy went, he just changed his MO and covered his tracks better. There's just no way anyone this evil just gets scared into hiding. What do you think? Did the Cleveland torso murderer ever stop? You know the drill. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one, people.